quiet suburban neighborhood of Northwood, there stood an old, dilapidated house at the end of the street. The house, known to locals as the Whispering House, had been abandoned for years. Its broken windows were covered in layers of grime, and the wooden frame creaked in the wind like a haunted sigh. No one had dared to live in it for over a decade, but it was said that strange things happened in the house. Strange noises at night, figures in the windows, and an atmosphere thick with unease. Jake, a young man new to the neighborhood, had heard rumors about the house, but never paid them much mind. When he and his friend Mark moved into the area, the house intrigued him. Jake was known for his curiosity, and Mark was always up for an adventure. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake suggested they check out the Whispering House. What they didn't know was that their decision would change their lives forever. The two friends stood at the iron gate of the house, staring at the overgrown yard and the broken windows. The wind howled, sending shivers down their spines. Despite the ominous feeling in the air, Jake pushed open the rusty gate and led the way to the front door. It was ajar, as if inviting them in. "You first," Mark said nervously, but Jake stepped forward, undeterred. The moment they entered, the air grew colder. The floorboards creaked beneath their feet, and the smell of mildew and decay filled their noses. The interior of the house was just as eerie as the exterior. Dusty furniture covered in sheets, peeling wallpaper, and cobwebs in every corner. The moonlight filtered in through the broken windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the rooms. Jake moved cautiously through the living room, his flashlight scanning the area. "I can't believe this place hasn't collapsed yet," Mark muttered, his voice echoing in the silence. As they ventured deeper into the house, they both felt it, a sense of being watched, as if invisible eyes were observing their every move. "Do you hear that?" Jake whispered. Mark stopped in his tracks, his eyes darting around. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint sound of something whispering. It was soft at first, barely audible, but as they listened, it grew clearer. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, and the words were chilling. "Leave. Leave now. Daniel." "Daniel?" Mark asked, his voice trembling. Jake turned to him, his face pale. "That's my name," he said softly. "I don't know how, but that came from inside this house." Before Mark could respond, the air grew even colder, and the whispers intensified, echoing through the house. It was as if the house itself was alive, responding to their presence. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls began to move, twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. Mark grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him toward the stairs. "We need to get out of here," he urged, panic setting in. They ascended the staircase, but as they reached the top, the whispers grew louder. It felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on them. The last step creaked underfoot, and the air turned frigid. A faint figure appeared at the end of the hallway, a shadowy shape standing motionless in the doorway. Jake's heart raced as he stared at the figure. It had hollow eyes, its mouth frozen in a silent scream. Its hands were clawed, reaching out toward them, its form shifting and flickering like a mirage. They stood frozen in terror, unable to move, as the figure took a slow, deliberate step forward. Suddenly, the floor beneath them cracked, and the figure lunged. Mark shouted in fear, pulling Jake backward just in time as the entity passed through them like a gust of wind. They stumbled backward crashing into a wall, and the room filled with an unbearable pressure, as if something was trying to force them out. With adrenaline pumping, Jake and Mark bolted for the stairs, barely looking back. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more urgent. They reached the front door, but as Jake grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. The whispers turned into frantic shouts. "Leave now, or you will never leave." Jake finally managed to push the door open, and they ran out into the night, not stopping until they reached the safety of their own house. They didn't speak for several minutes, both in shock, their breaths ragged. The next morning, Jake and Mark met with their neighbor, a man named Marv, who lived across the street. They explained what happened, but Marv just stared at them, his expression unreadable. "You're lucky," he said cryptically. "That house has a history. People come and go, but no one stays. It's cursed." Jake and Mark never spoke of the house again. They moved out of the neighborhood a week later, eager to leave the whispering house behind. It still stood there, as eerie and abandoned as ever, but now they understood the true terror it held. The house had called to them, and they had answered, but they were lucky to escape with their lives. As they drove away from Northwood, the whispers followed them in their minds, and they knew they would never forget the name the house had whispered: Daniel. Lena had recently moved into an old Victorian home in a sleepy town on the outskirts of the city. The house had been on the market for years, and when she saw the price, she couldn't resist. The realtor had warned her that the house had a history, but Lena shrugged it off, thinking it was just an old house with a few rumors attached to it. She was excited to start fresh in her new home, unaware that the house was hiding dark secrets, waiting to be discovered. On her first night in the house, Lena made sure to unpack most of her things. The house was large, with an attic that she had been curious about since her first tour. It was locked with a rusty padlock that creaked every time she touched it. But tonight, after a long day of settling in, Lena felt the need to explore. She climbed the stairs to the attic, the air growing cooler with each step. The house was old, and every creak of the floorboards made the house feel alive, like it was watching her. Lena finally managed to unlock the padlock with an old key she found in a drawer. The door to the attic groaned as she pushed it open. The attic was dusty and filled with old furniture and forgotten belongings, a time capsule of the house's past. At first, it seemed harmless, just an abandoned space filled with relics from a bygone era. But as Lena moved further into the attic, her eyes fell upon something strange. A large, antique mirror leaning against the wall. It was covered in dust, and the glass was cracked, but it seemed oddly compelling. Curious, she approached it and wiped away the dust. As she did, she noticed something out of the corner of her eye, a figure standing in the shadows of the attic, motionless. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned to look, but saw nothing, just the empty space. Confused but unsettled, Lena shrugged it off and started to head downstairs. But before she could reach the door, she felt a cold hand brush against her arm. Her heart raced, and she spun around. But again, there was nothing there. The shadows seemed to move, as if alive, and the temperature dropped drastically. Suddenly, she heard a whisper, soft at first, but growing louder. The voice was deep and distorted, as though it was coming from a faraway place. "You shouldn't have come up here," it hissed. Lena's legs went weak, and she stumbled back toward the door. As she did, she glanced into the cracked mirror. Her reflection was not alone. Behind her, in the dim reflection, stood a tall, dark figure with hollow eyes and a crooked smile. It was as if the mirror was showing her something that shouldn't be there. Panicked, Lena ran down the stairs, but as she reached the bottom, she heard footsteps following her. Heavy, slow, deliberate steps. She turned back, expecting to see something, but there was nothing in the hallway. The footsteps stopped, but the whispering voice grew louder, almost like it was in her ear. "Get out." Lena rushed to the front door, barely managing to unlock it. She ran into the night, not looking back. The whispers and the footsteps echoed in her mind, and she never felt safe in the house again. The next day, Lena packed her bags and left the house. She didn't bother trying to sell it. She knew she couldn't stay there. As she walked away from the house, she glanced up at the attic window. In the reflection of the glass, she saw the same dark figure standing there, watching her leave. The house had called to her, and she had answered, but she realized too late that it didn't want her to leave. The house sat empty once more, but Lena knew the truth. The shadow in the attic was still there, waiting for the next person to step inside, to be drawn into its dark, eternal grip. In the heart of the fog-covered countryside stood an old, weather-beaten inn called the Lantern's Light. It was said to be haunted, but that didn't deter travelers from seeking refuge there. The inn had been abandoned for many years, yet every night a lantern would glow faintly in one of the upstairs windows, as if someone or something was still there. Evelyn, a young woman traveling alone, arrived at the inn one chilly autumn evening. She had been walking through the dense woods for hours and had lost her way. When she saw the faint glow of the lantern in the distance, she hurried toward it, relieved to find a place to stay for the night. She had heard the rumors of the inn's haunted past, but she dismissed them, thinking it was just superstition. As she entered the inn, the wooden door creaked on its hinges, and the warm glow of the hearth greeted her. It seemed like a cozy place, though the air smelled of dust and age. The innkeeper, a tall man with pale skin and tired eyes, welcomed her. He seemed oddly distant, but she thought nothing of it. She needed rest and decided to retire early to her room on the second floor. The room was small and sparsely furnished with an old iron bed, a worn chair, and a faint smell of mildew. The window was cracked, and outside, the wind howled through the trees. Evelyn tried to settle in, but the eerie quiet of the inn made her uneasy. As she lay on the bed, trying to sleep, she noticed something strange. The faint light of a lantern glowing from the room across the hall. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but when she peeked out from her room, the light remained. The lantern was glowing softly through the crack in the door across the hall, casting long shadows on the floor. She crept closer, curiosity gnawing at her, and reached for the handle. The door creaked open, and Evelyn found herself in a small sitting room. There, on a dusty table, stood a lantern with a flickering flame, casting a strange glow across the room. The air felt heavy and cold, and her breath formed visible clouds in front of her. Evelyn felt drawn to the lantern, the light seeming to call her closer. As she reached out to touch it, the door slammed shut behind her. She jumped, startled, and turned around, but there was no one there. The room grew darker, and the lantern's flame flickered as if reacting to her fear. Suddenly, the temperature dropped even further, and Evelyn could see her breath in the air. A soft whisper echoed through the room, faint at first, but growing louder. "Evelyn, you shouldn't have come." She froze, her heart racing. The whisper came from the dark corners of the room, as if it were coming from the walls themselves. Panicking, she turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. She pushed and pulled at the handle, but it was as if it had been sealed shut by some unseen force. The whispers grew more frantic, and the lantern's light turned from a soft glow to an intense, almost blinding flame. As the light flickered, a shadowy figure appeared in the corner of the room. It was a woman, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. Her long, tattered dress billowed as if caught in a draft, though there was no wind. "You shouldn't have taken the lantern," the figure whispered, its voice a hiss. Evelyn screamed, stumbling backward, her heart hammering in her chest. The ghostly figure reached out, her fingers elongated, her grip like ice. Evelyn fought with all her strength, finally throwing open the door and escaping into the hallway. She ran down the stairs, hearing the whispering follow her, growing louder with every step. She burst through the front door, the cold night air slapping her face. As she looked back, the lantern's light flickered one last time in the upstairs window before vanishing completely. Evelyn never looked back. She ran as fast as she could into the night, her mind filled with the whispers that still echoed in her ears. The next morning, Evelyn was found outside, shaken but alive. She tried to explain what happened to the townspeople, but they just nodded sadly and whispered among themselves. The inn had been abandoned for decades, and no one dared to stay there after dark. The lantern, they said, was the spirit of a woman who had died in the inn long ago, trapped between worlds, forever calling out to those who dared to enter. Evelyn left the town and never spoke of that night again. But as the years went by, she could never shake the feeling that sometimes, in the dead of night, she would hear a faint whisper calling her name, beckoning her back to the lantern's light. In a small, desolate village at the edge of the forest, there stood a grand mansion that had long been abandoned. The mansion had a history shrouded in mystery, with rumors circulating that it was once home to a young bride who had mysteriously disappeared on her wedding night. The villagers spoke of strange happenings near the mansion, but no one dared to approach the place, fearing the curse that seemed to linger there. One autumn evening, Clara, a curious young woman, came to the village to visit her cousin. She had heard whispers about the mansion and the tragic bride, and her curiosity got the better of her. Clara was fascinated by ghost stories and had always wanted to investigate a haunted place. When her cousin warned her about the mansion, Clara laughed it off. She was determined to see it for herself. As Clara ventured toward the mansion, she noticed that the trees surrounding it were unnaturally twisted, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. The mansion loomed in the distance, its windows dark and its once beautiful facade crumbling with age. A sense of unease settled over Clara, but she pressed on, eager to uncover the secrets of the place. When she arrived at the front gates, they creaked open with a gust of wind, as if the mansion was inviting her in. Clara hesitated for a moment, But the lure of the mystery was too strong. She entered the grounds and made her way to the front door, which, to her surprise, was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, and the door groaned loudly as it swung on its hinges. The inside of the mansion was dimly lit by the soft light filtering through the dusty windows. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the floors creaked under Clara's every step. The grand staircase in the foyer was lined with faded portraits of the mansion's former inhabitants. At the top of the stairs, a door stood slightly open, and Clara felt an overwhelming urge to explore further. As she ascended the stairs, the temperature in the house dropped dramatically, and Clara could feel a strange pressure in the air. She reached the door at the top of the stairs and slowly pushed it open. The room was beautiful, but eerily still. Dust-covered furniture, a grand four-poster bed, and an antique mirror hung on the wall. But it was the bed that caught Clara's attention. A long white wedding dress was draped over the bed, its delicate lace glistening in the faint light. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her, and Clara spun around in shock. The room grew darker, and the faint sound of a piano playing a haunting tune echoed from somewhere deep within the house. Clara's heart raced as she turned toward the window, where a figure appeared, a woman in a wedding dress, her face obscured by a veil. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The figure stood perfectly still, but Clara could feel the woman's eyes upon her. The piano music grew louder, and the ghostly figure started to move toward her, its steps slow but deliberate. The temperature continued to drop, and Clara could see her breath in the air. "Help me," the figure whispered, her voice faint and hollow. Clara stepped back, but the door was locked. She tried to escape, but the woman was closer now, her veiled face still hidden in the shadows. Her once beautiful wedding gown was now tattered, and her hands were outstretched toward Clara, as if begging for release. Clara screamed and pounded on the door, but the figure was upon her in an instant. She felt a cold hand brush against her arm, and the air around her grew even colder. Suddenly, everything went black. When Clara awoke, she was lying on the cold marble floor of the mansion's foyer, the door to the room wide open. The mansion was silent once more. The piano had stopped playing, and the wedding dress was gone. The house seemed to have returned to its abandoned state, as if nothing had ever happened. In a small, desolate village at the edge of the forest, there stood a grand mansion that had long been abandoned. The mansion had a history shrouded in mystery, with rumors circulating that it was once home to a young bride who had mysteriously disappeared on her wedding night. The villagers spoke of strange happenings near the mansion, but no one dared to approach the place, fearing the curse that seemed to linger there. One autumn evening, Clara, a curious young woman, came to the village to visit her cousin. She had heard whispers about the mansion and the tragic bride, and her curiosity got the better of her. Clara was fascinated by ghost stories and had always wanted to investigate a haunted place. When her cousin warned her about the mansion, Clara laughed it off. She was determined to see it for herself.